Hello,
Hi,
Kate.
I'm back.
I don't know. I don't know if
see
the
you.
schedule
I don't know if
works.
you can see me.
Yes.
But I can certainly hear you, which is great.
So I'll try to facilitate. We'll form some kind of Magrittean cascade here, and we'll see how
Fantastic.
this goes. So we'll have this conversation for a little bit, and then we'll open it up also to questions from both of our speakers as well. Safiya, I'm gonna let you get into it, but I wanted to give you a little question to start off with. It seems like everybody wants to talk about ethics and AI at the moment. Governments want to talk about it, big tech, journalists, engineers. At the same time, as Kate has just shown us, we have algos that just won't stop labeling people 49% sad, anti-Semite tosser, and all these other variants of it. So what is... Sorry, I shouldn't have combined those, should I? What is this moment we're in, I guess, is what I'm asking. How do we talk about ethics vis-a-vis power, as Kate has brought up? And how do we talk about the effort of the powerful to try and say that they're doing ethics or they're figuring out ethics for us?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. And this is the second time I've had to follow Kate Crawford in a talk. So pray for me, y'all.
Sorry, Safiya.
Kate knows I love her so much, and she always says all my keywords before me, like white supremacy and patriarchy, too. So I always feel like she's got it. She's nailed it. So thanks for the prompt there. And you know, it's not lost on me that after 30 years, at least, of conversations in our many fields here represented today, of voices that I would consider kind of from the margins of many fields, you know, including Wendy Chun for sure, Lisa Nakamura, Anna Everett. I mean, these are the women of color who were foundational to my own work and who have been talking about issues of discrimination, that made a way for, you know, people like me to talk about oppression and discrimination in today's moment. And those conversations have been happening in a much larger scope than the narrow scope of ethics. And so I find it interesting that after, again, you know, decades now of women of color, for the most part, having been, and white feminists and LGBTQ scholars, really opening up these conversations, challenging the logics of technologies, that now those women are largely being erased from that history. And of course, it has been women journalists who have done so much to translate a lot of our work. I mean, I'm particularly grateful to the women journalists who have made my work visible over the last few years. And the words that we might have used and have been using from these other paradigms, like justice, like inequality, oppression, liberation, possibility, are radically being reduced, in my opinion, to very narrow frameworks, philosophical frameworks of ethics. What that allows us to do when that happens is to erase, again, conceptually, other paradigms that should be in consideration. And for me, you know, I'll tell you, when I first wrote, I proposed to Eileen Kalish, my editor at NYU Press, the title for my book, Algorithms of Oppression. She was like, girl, no. No. First of all, nobody knows what an algorithm is. So that tells you how long I was writing this book. And then, you know, over the years, people have said things like, well, why don't you say, you know, why don't you use words like diversity or, you know, freedom? And I think, again, you know, using words like diversity and equity and inclusion, which are often also attached to other words like fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics, again, puts us in a very narrow paradigm. And I think also has us attributing the source of our concerns to the individual practices, the individual practices of programmers, the individual practices of people in the C-suite in tech companies, the individual consumer practices, rather than, I think, as Nick talked about yesterday so brilliantly, and let me just say it's incredibly unnerving to sit before a room of all my heroes and speak, but when we talk about ethics, I find it interesting, again, that the kind of new emergent voices around ethics are kind of the ex-tech reformists, the new kind of ex-tech evangelists who are, in their own ways, I guess, trying to atone for their sins. I'm not sure. But these are the voices that are on Good Morning America, for example, last week, talking about, their rigorous research of putting Post-it notes up all over their office and looking for slogans to talk about the downgrading of society, but that's not what we're here to talk about. So these are the kinds of things that I think, again, are starting to take center stage in the conversation about ethics. And, one of the things that I love and appreciate so much about Kate's presentation in kind of helping us reframe is that these political struggles over the classification of knowledge and ideas have been with us since the beginning of human beings recording and documenting our histories. So these are old library questions, for example, about the politics of knowledge and the relationship, the relational kind of data. They didn't call it data when they were organizing scrolls, but this idea of whose knowledge is captured in what context and how does it get redeployed. And I think that the framework of ethics is one that we should put on the table and challenge, maybe.
So as a way to continue this and bring Kate into the conversation as well. I mean, Safiya, when you talk about the reformed ex-tech people, I'm thinking about the recent New York Times article by Chris Hughes, one of the folks who have been with Mark Zuckerberg all this time, where he turns around and says we need to break up Facebook. And what's striking is you've got these photos of two white male tech guys that almost look like the same people looking side to side, and one is Mark and one is Chris. So this is the kind of people that are at center stage right now, perhaps, joining some of these calls, starting to talk about some of these issues. But we also have the Google Ethics Board and what happened to that, where Google said we're going to start an ethics of AI board. It turns out they had folks from the Heritage Foundation in there, and there was a public outcry. So in tandem with all of this in tandem, I guess the question for Safiya and also Kate is not just we must talk about ethics, but who talks about ethics and how does that conversation take place and how does that conversation need to be organized in order to avoid what Kate called white supremacy in the name of objectivity. Kate, would you like to jump in first?
Well, first of all, can I say I love this question, and thank you, Safiya, for your really important reframing specifically of how this term ethics is sort of deracinated and narrowed some of these very important debates that have centuries behind them, but certainly multiple decades of thinking about technological systems and justice. I have many things to say about what we saw about the recent use of the so-called ethics board at Google. I mean, it was interesting, actually, of course, because one of the things that AI Now has published about, in fact, our report from 2018, just 3 months before all of that happened, specifically has a section called Why Ethics is Not Enough. And specifically why we need to start really looking at these issues around asymmetries of power, who gets to decide and who really gets to see into these systems and really decide what gets built and who gets most impacted. And then to see this sort of process play out where, in the name of balance, we saw Kay Cole James from the Heritage Foundation, who has been on the record really denying the rights of trans and LGBTQ people. To see that sort of really front and center has been, I think, a very important moment to see how this term ethics has been deployed by some in industry. And I think it's an important moment for us to really think about what that word can mean. I don't want to give up on that word completely. It does actually have some very important scholarly and philosophical traditions that we can use. But I agree with Safiya, it's simply too narrow to talk about what is currently going on, specifically with big tech.
Yeah, one of the challenges, I agree, Kate, that, it's like we need some of these concepts to organize around. but I don't want to lose sight of thinking about how the way that we're deploying the conversation about ethics is often about perfecting the technology. I mean, to me, that's the primary impulse, is to make it, this is where these words like unbiased or biased tech or addressing the bias, addressing this gets framed. And of course, Anna Lauren Hoffman's here and wrote these amazing papers about this. So just really, you could just read her work and then we could all take a coffee break. But
plus one to that,
right? So I think thinking about is the desire to make a more perfect technology, and I feel like some of the impulse around AI and ethics is to take the so-called bias out of the technology, and then everything's fine. And there's nothing to see here. And of course, these projects we know are deployed out on the public with no engagement whatsoever, no oversight. I was on a panel recently with Jeff Larson of the Markup, previously of ProPublica, who was one of the reporters, along with Julia Angwin, who broke the story about North Point and the recidivism software that was being used in the state of Florida to, over-convict African Americans, to keep them imprisoned in jail longer. One of the things that was interesting is he shared out that when they went back and talked to the programmers about the, racist bias of their software, it was really like 3 guys in a strip mall who were making software that they then sold to the state. And I thought, it's interesting that we would never let 3 guys in a strip mall make up some drugs and then sell it at CVS on the weekend. It's just like the logics of oversight, the logics of so-called participation, of public safety. Those logics are not a part of the conversation. A lot of the logics, I think, are focused on, again, somehow testing out, better classifying our metadata, for example. And those are, I think, that's just such a narrow band within which the conversations are happening. So I guess my provocation for this morning and our conversation today is, what other ways could we reimagine these conversations that really fully complicate the deployment and the use and even the making of some of the kinds of structures and new forms of oppression that are, quite frankly, so much more opaque, so much more difficult to see into and even discuss. And I think this is one of the things that, I loved about Cathy O'Neill's work when she said, you can't take an algorithm to court. So, these ideas about how we would even intervene upon and find justice from AI is really, to me, a more interesting part of the conversation that could be focused on too.
So when you mentioned this idea that, technology always tells you, oh, something's wrong with this technology, we're going to develop a new piece of technology to fix the problem with the old one, and then when this one breaks, we'll release something else for you to buy. And this idea that we've got to go a bit deeper than that, we've got to look at more fundamental issues with that. And listening to Kate's talk, I guess what strikes me is these labels are obviously not okay. But Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess the point isn't just that we should get better labels. I guess I find myself asking myself, what could be an okay label to put on people in this way? What if the very act of putting these labels is not okay? But for now, I want to ask both of you a little bit about the regulation side of all this, because there's been such great momentum right now across the public saying these things need to be regulated, these things need to be broken up, a la Chris Hughes, a la Liz Warren. And of course, something that came up in the conference yesterday in multiple places was, again, regulation, and how Silicon Valley itself keeps saying, please let us self-regulate, we'll do a great job of it, we promise. So I guess the question to both of you is, how does this current call for regulation fit in with the way both of you think about ethics and AI? What is the conversation that needs to happen here to get us towards the right kinds of regulation, or do we need to get away from that focus on regulation even? Kate, sure. Yeah, let's go.
Yeah, sure. So one thing I would like to make very clear, which I know I reiterated a few times in the talk, but I'd like to repeat again, is that what I'm really looking at here is that we are looking at an inherent politics of classification. It doesn't matter if you try to improve the labels, if you try to perfect the technology, that this is an inherently political act that is being made by very small numbers of people. And this is a profound flaw that you cannot get beyond. And this is something that, I can show you technically, I can show you philosophically, but I think it's important that we do both. But what is really key, and that I hope that, certainly everybody in that room knows, but I think many more people need to hear this message, is that these technologies are not things that can be perfected away from these kinds of essentially political questions. That the political work that these systems do is absolutely inherent into how they are constructed. They are designed to remake the world, which is indeed, as I said, the mission statement of ImageNet. And that is something which is very profound and I think raises very serious concerns, both in terms of the democratic issues with these technologies, but also about these ideas around colonialism and how information is being harvested and deployed. So I would agree that what we've seen is, I think, a real narrowing of some of these questions. I would perhaps add an orthogonal point to what Safiya said in relation to the fact that there hasn't been enough focus on safety and in control of these systems. There is, in fact, an entire sort of subfield called AI safety, which has been almost entirely a technical subdiscipline. It's one that I think has been really narrowed to look purely at, what are the sort of objective functions of particular technical systems. The work of Roel Dobby and others are really trying to explore and expand this idea of safety to start looking at, what sorts of worlds we want to live in. But there's certainly some work in that domain. But what we are not seeing, I think, is this much more profound discussion around the classificatory impulse, this will to classify that comes through AI systems and what the downstream results are going to be of those sorts of systems. So from turning to that to thinking a little bit about regulation, I really want to provoke the room for a different question, which is to ask, what is our theory of change here? I mean, one of the reasons that we created the AI Now Institute several years ago now was precisely to really contribute to this history of critical AI studies, but also to think about theories of change, because I think it's not enough for us just to sort of, sit in our high chairs and say, oh, well, I mean, this is terrible. There's a will to classify. We've seen a long history of this. This is not good. That's not really going to cut it when you're looking at extraordinarily powerful systems being run by less than 7 companies worldwide, who are some of the richest companies that there are. I mean, realistically, we're looking at something that it's much more urgent than simply just sort of looking at its obvious limitations. So what I would suggest in terms of theories of change is that regulation has very real issues in terms of how it is made, particularly in the US and particularly the sort of lobbying schemes that go behind it. But I think it is important that we are starting to see technology companies say these tools actually require regulation. Now, to some degree, we can dive into the histories of why they're saying that and where that can be self-serving and where it might not be. But certainly when I see what just happened in San Francisco this week, where there was a ban of facial recognition only in some contexts, obviously, it's, again, no legislation is perfect. But it has shown that there is a desire to push back on the so-called inevitability of these tools. The idea that they must always be rolled out, they cannot be stopped, and all we can do is carve out these small spaces with terms like privacy or ethics written on them. We can do much more, and I think there's actually a culture of refusal that is starting to build. And I think that is one of these areas for a theory of change that I think is incredibly important. The second one I obviously want to briefly mention here because it's something very important to the AI Now Institute is worker organizing. We've seen extraordinary worker organizing within tech companies. We've seen it inside Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Uber. The list is getting very long indeed. And what is important about that is we're starting to see the call coming from inside the house. We're seeing workers say, we have real concerns about the way that these tools are being designed and deployed, and we actually want to shut it down. That is, again, a very powerful theory of change. It, again, has limitations. But when we start to think about these sorts of spaces, I want us to try and think, what does change look like? Because that is, I think, going to be one of the most important questions we can answer in the next decade.
Yeah, Kate, I'm going to pick up on your theory of change. You know, I wrote, what is the theory of change that we want to see? And I think better articulating kind of this anti-capitalist, anti-racist, radically intersectional feminist world would be a framework, again, for reimagining how we talk about and interpret what should exist, what should not exist, what should be taken out of existence. And I think that's the part that we are grappling with. Certainly researchers are grappling with, like, well, what's the point? What is the end game? What's the value system behind or driving? What are the politics that are driving the kinds of choices that we would make? I struggle with not hearing enough about the implications of letting some of these things go. And I think part of that's because we certainly have a research community that underrepresents those who are most vulnerable. And so those concerns don't always get put at the center of our concerns. To the point of regulation, you know, the challenge, I think, is that we have limited vocabularies or histories of ways of thinking about, certainly in the US. I will give it to the Europeans and other parts of the world, the non-US places that will, you know, strike and get out in the streets in a way that people in the US, quite frankly, don't do as much of yet. And so the question then, I think, is about the ways in which we've historically enacted change or fought for rights, which has primarily been through the courts. And this, again, puts people into a legalistic kind of regulatory mindset about how we garner rights. That certainly has been a fundamental part of securing civil rights for Black people and LGBTQ communities. And so I think we're also in a political tension over, Nick gave us these kind of frameworks yesterday, these like assimilationist kinds of strategies, reformist strategies, or other kinds of radical interventions. And so I think these are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about as well for our work as scholars and students becoming scholars, is what is our role in kind of bolstering a radical politic of intervention too, because this is the place where, here hundreds of us are gathered, and, again, I think with Wendy as our, leader and organizer at this moment, and in this tradition, if we were to think in your tradition and the tradition of your work, and those who are here, how would we organize also and harness our research and our work in kind of new imaginary that is, quite frankly, not entirely united, but certainly could also be some other different space besides regulation? Because a lot of regulation is informed by research, quite frankly. I mean, I know many people in this room and that are not here, that are with us on Twitter, are people who submit testimony and help write policy all the time. So I think we have to think about what our role is in bolstering democratic institutions, democratic responses, and certainly regulation, again, is like one band in thinking about that. But the problem is you can't, and I say this oftentimes to policymakers, you can't kind of be on a soapbox about regulating the tech industries, and you're simultaneously gutting every single democratic institution that could be a counterweight. So you can't gut higher education funding, public libraries, public media that stand as a powerful counterweight. You can't let multinational corporations pull and extract all of our tax base out, offshore all of their profits, not pay taxes back into the system, and then say, we don't have any way to stand up to what big tech is doing, or any tech, or any big industry is doing. So I think these are the kinds of different imaginaries that we need to have, and we need to be thinking more holistically.
You're looking at me, but I agree with everything. So it's hard to put something at the end of that, right? But I mean, I guess as a way of saying, please tell us more. It seems like what we're getting at too is this idea that there needs to be a bit of a paradigm shift, right? Where the way sometimes the word ethics is used, as Kate has mentioned as well, becomes a way of narrowing some of those possibilities around more fundamental critique or provocation. And what are some of the, I don't want to ask this question of, what do we do right now with our coffee cups, but what are some of the steps that we can take here? What are some of the questions that we need to begin with in order to say, let's change the paradigm a little bit. Let's get beyond this kind of business as usual in the world of having nice little ethics boards and nice little consultations.
Well, I think, Kate, I look at what you and Meredith, did in terms of organizing scholars to respond and friends, to respond to Google's nonsense ethics board. And I think, this was like when I think about tech workers, in some ways, those of us who also work on tech are also tech workers, so that our lane of organizing, I think, has been really important. And I'm really grateful to Meredith for the work that she did on that. Certainly, just last week, a number of us signed on to a letter that was filed in a brief in New York opposing facial recognition by landlords to allow people to get into their homes using facial recognition, which is actually a case that is going forward in New York. So I think there are things, it's important to me to think about organizing kind of in my community where I am, and that's this room. So, one of the things that I've also been thinking about, we talked about this for a minute yesterday, is, what if people like us in this room organized in the way that researchers organized against big tobacco? And so I've been thinking about, I'm from the 70s, y'all. I remember, for example, when, doctors were smoking in the doctor's office, right? I mean, my mom remembers the time when, the ads that ran in magazines for women were like 4 out of 5 doctors recommend Marlboro, right? Or Virginia Slims. So, it took an incredible amount of organizing among public health workers and researchers to fully dislodge big tobacco. It took decades, but it was very powerful. Ultimately, there was a class action lawsuit that resulted in the tobacco industry having to put back billions of dollars into consumer education, firewalled off research that they could not touch, unlike their bogus research of decades before. I think we need our own kind of truth in tech type of moment, the way that big tobacco had. And I think we need to organize ourselves, and we should be demanding that these tech companies put billions of dollars that, quite frankly, they've extracted from people all over the world and put that back into research, public advocacy, consumer protection, all of the work that needs to be done. Because I know that none of us in this room are balling out of control and can fund that on our own. And yet here we are, except for maybe Wendy, because she's got this new center, so drinks on Wendy. So, I think these are the kinds of things that we can do, and we have other models, so we don't have to leave kind of depleted. People are always like, Safiya, you're always down on Google, or you're down on tech, and, you're just a downer. And I feel like, the work of Kate and so many people in this room inspire me and make me think about, well, what are our forms of resistance? And what are the things we can do that are in our lane? Should we be adding a day or half a day or a pre-conference or post-conference to all of our conferences where we meet to organize, not just meet to share research? I mean, we can do those kinds of things among ourselves. And I think those are hopeful possibilities, right? So, get at me if you want to work together and we want to think about some of these things, because I think that we don't have to feel hopeless and we don't just have to put a flashlight on the problems. We can also organize a response.
Kate, would you like to jump in here, or I see you nodding, but
I would say a hearty hear applause to that one. Absolutely beautifully put, and I couldn't agree more. And I think that the things that have inspired me most in the last year has been, well, first of all, my colleagues here at the AI Now Institute, and the fact that thinking about these questions of organizing have been lived side by side with doing the research. And, while these processes have been going on with Google actively retaliating specifically against the women who organized the 20,000 employee walkout across Google offices around the world, every one of those organizers has experienced forms of retaliation. But at the same time, in sort of seeing that and organizing against it, we've also had an extraordinary group of researchers doing deep dives into the archives, looking at all of the moments in history where we saw, say, the computer professionals for social responsibility in the 1980s. We saw again pushback in the 1990s. We have a long history of people organizing around these questions. We are not the first. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I look at figures like Joan Greenbaum, who wrote amazing books in the 1970s and 80s, looking at issues around labor rights, specifically in sort of computer professional industries, who comes and speaks to us here and gives us strength in the work that we do. And really sort of connecting that organizing to research, I think, is incredibly important. I've also been really inspired to see we've actually had some successes, guys. This isn't something we're always going to get, but for those of us living in New York, I mean, to see the extraordinary pushback against Amazon when they tried to sort of muscle in, take enormous tax breaks to set up a huge office in Queens. I mean, we were there in the streets. There were extraordinary numbers of people who were turning up to meetings and really saying, this is not acceptable. This is not what we want in our community. We've also seen New York City create the first ever algorithmic decision-making task force. Now, that obviously is a very, in itself, a sort of complicated structure, which has had issues of its own. But the mere fact that things like this are being set up now at a local level, I think, give me hope. And the fact that we have started to see, real protests, lots of people starting to actually down tools and have strikes at work around these specific issues is new. We just had an enormous Uber and Lyft strike as well around the IPOs and listings. We need to look at these moments and say, how do we support them? Not necessarily have to sort of reconstruct everything ourselves, but to sort of draw the threads between all of these actions that I think are starting to happen at the moment. Because, frankly, there are some really inspiring things. And I would have said something very differently to you when we were having this conversation 3 years ago. But right now I see some real signs of hope.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so I'm not even going to try and add anything to that. But I think we can open it up now to questions from the room. I'm sure we have enough questions to lock the door and do it for a few days, but to maximize the time that we do have, what I'd like to do here is take a couple of questions at a time and then invite both of our panelists to respond. Please do keep your questions brief. If you could raise your hands, I believe we'll bring you a mic, I think. Is that a system that we have in place? Yes, I think so. Yes, over there at the back in blue. Yes.
First of all, thank you for the great insights. We have discussed that Google and Facebook are too powerful, but in my opinion, it's not their fault. It's us, people at large, who give them power. It is like we give them power and then we ask government, please something do about that. So my question is, as we, the one who give them power, what can we do to stop them being too powerful? What can we do tomorrow? I'd like to share you a little bit what I have done. I don't use Google anymore. Now I use a search engine that called DuckDuckGo because it says it doesn't track us. And I still use Facebook, but I put a fake birthday on that. I don't know if that's helpful, but I'd like to
I think Siva would say
see
no.
what your advice. Thank you.
And just in front there, please. Yes.
Thank you both. This was so inspiring. I'm really moved. I wanted to ask a question about the question of regulation in relationship to the differential right to privacy, because the EU, when they passed their data protections, exempted, for instance, all migrants and refugees from the same data protections. And it seems like there has always been, particularly in relationship to visuality, a differential right to privacy, that social documentary was founded on poor people being legible and visible in public space. Lisa Nakamura's talk yesterday was about VR in the favelas and the kind of obscenity of being able to move through these spaces of poverty, right? So how do the regulations then just replicate the very structures of power if we're asking for regulations that differentiate between privacy? It's no accident that it's in San Francisco that they worked against. It's the tech bros who are creating this who now have the privacy around facial recognition, right? So I'm thinking about the ideas that are within decolonizing thought right now, that recognition is always a trap, right? So facial recognition is always a trap because of the capture by legislative and political, economic and cultural apparatuses that continue to differentiate, like, who then is mapped and who then isn't mapped. And so is it better regulations? Is it alternative classifications? Are there decolonial classification systems that are fanciful and critical that could be fed into the system? Like, how do we then think about how we do it in a way that actually addresses social justice issues and doesn't recreate hierarchies of capture and privacy?
Yeah, Kate, Safiya, if you'd like to respond, and any other?
That's a really important question, and it has many parts, and so I couldn't possibly do it all justice. But let me just pull a couple of threads from that and to address it. Particularly in this idea of could we create decolonizing classifications? And I think there's been a lot of scholarly work and artistic work trying to do that. And I think certainly, I look to artists like Heather Jury Hagborg, to Martine Sims, to Trevor Paglen and others who really sort of try to challenge image creation systems and to give us different ways of seeing. I am, however, constitutionally quite pessimistic about this idea of, building AI for good or AI that creates, sort of different ways of seeing. I worry that in doing that, we follow down a path of trying to construct tools while outpacing these enormously powerful, enormously wealthy corporations that, of course, will be reaching far more people and locking people into systems that they have very little choice other than to use. And allow me to also address the first question and this idea that, what can we do? Can we just stop using Facebook and Google? I think, again, many scholars have pointed to why while that might feel good in the moment, that it is simply not adequate to the ways in which these systems are structurally built into everything that we do. One of the things that we focus on particularly here as researchers are sort of the infrastructural politics of big tech, and we're really looking at really just three large planetary systems on which almost all other sort of new tech is being built on. We could look at AWS, we can look at Azure, we can look at Google Cloud. And this is something that I am now deeply invested in understanding more, which is what are the infrastructural politics of these large-scale systems. It really doesn't matter if you have a Facebook page or not, because as we know, Facebook creates ghost pages for everybody who's not on the system. If you're using DuckDuckGo on your phone, your geolocation is still being tracked and fed back to multiple companies and then on-sold. So one of the things that when we were working on the Anatomy of AI project, which was like a multi-year project looking specifically at what it takes to make a single Amazon Echo function. If you look at all of the extractive industries, from mining to data extraction to forms of labor extraction and exploitation, these are very big interconnected systems. This is much more than just an act of individual refusal. So how do we start to then draw on those trajectories of research and thinking and resistance in each one of those spaces around things like extraction and mining, around specifically labor movements and labor movements in factories as well as sort of in shiny high-tech workspaces? Again, I'm really interested in drawing those threads together and creating sort of active cultures of resistance rather than necessarily just trying to create a better form of AI. I think we have a much harder task, which is to really start to unite different political movements that are raising these questions in important ways.
Yeah, Kate's really nailing it to me, too. I would say these are global, interconnected systems of power, and they can't be resolved at the individual level. And that's actually the trap. Part of, to me, also the trap of talking about ethics is that those are personal choices, right? Those aren't necessarily structural conversations about kind of political and economic organization that quite frankly, I mean, exist and can only exist upon continued systems of enslavement and exploitation and occupation, and there's no way around it. They're deeply connected and intertwined, and not just historically, but also in the contemporary moment. So I don't think that these are things that just get solved by deleting Facebook. But I also think there could be ways, and you know, the question about the differential is incredibly important. You know, if you look at the United Nations human rights work, for example, and there are great scholars working on this right now at Goldsmith in the UK, and the ways in which, you know, people who become migrants because of displacement have to be put into tracking systems. And you look at other places like biometrics used to secure your food or your food rations in rural India and other places. These are large-scale deployed systems that people cannot get in or out of easily. So we absolutely have to, I think more broadly. I mean, one of the things that I try to do with my work is just always centering the people who are most vulnerable, because then we ask different questions. And when we ask different questions, we might come up with different kinds of imaginaries. One of the things, for example, in California that I'm working on right now is trying to think about something like digital amnesty. You know, what would it mean if, for example, everything you ever did on the internet, this is of course just for my kids and yours too, but like everything that you've ever done on the internet until you're 30 gets wiped and doesn't follow you into your future, because really your brain's not fully developed until you're about 27 or 28. And so we need a buffer for those who aren't developing as quickly. I don't know what the number is, but you know, like, why can't we have digital amnesty? Why can't we wipe records clean? Why can't we reimagine? Those are policy possibilities too. So I think, of course, you know, you're raising the right conversational points, which is noticing these differentials and being able to imagine something different from there.
We'll take a couple
I also suggest that for some of us, our brains are still developing until we're 90.
I know.
So we'd really like to have a digital amnesty for the
I need a
whole
do-over
of our
right now.
lifespan. That would be great.
It never ends. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions, this time from the back of the room, maybe? Or no? Do I see? Okay, let's move it to the front a little bit. And there's one right behind you, just there. Yes.
Hi, thanks, that was great. Safiya, you mentioned sort of the role of female journalists in championing your work. And then you also mentioned what scholars can do. So what I'm wondering about is like how much of the responsibility of communicating and getting the word out about this to the public, to policymakers, etc., is in the hands of scholars, and how much of it, in your view, is in the hands of the media?
Well, you know,
Maybe we'll take one more.
Okay,
and
sorry.
Then call it
Yeah.
today. Sorry, there was one right here.
write that down.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. That was super interesting to me. And I think my question is related to this, to the question that just was done. And so, super quick, I was interested in going back to the idea of theories of change. And so we have been talking about regulation and also the cultures of resistance. And so I was wondering if you see any potential of creating awareness on, the university, in particularly in programs such as computer science, software development, and also tech business and tech management programs. And if you, raising awareness through bringing people who are enrolled in those programs to these places. I mean, places such as this conference, or places where researchers such as you can, provide some knowledge, lots of knowledge, in terms of the dangers and the limitations of AI and technology in general. And so if you see that potential, I was wondering why it's not very, at least I perceive there is no such courses right now on the curricula of those programs. And so, yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that I think is happening is, for example, we have these new centers emerging, a handful of them led by women of color. So Wendy here and Lisa Nakamura at Michigan, and there's a center at Berkeley. Sarah Roberts and I are starting a new critical internet studies center at UCLA this summer. And so there are these kinds of different voices that are starting to have minor amounts of resources. I think what's difficult is it does take resources to do the kind of public engagement, public intellectual work, or to cultivate oneself, for example, to be an intellectual that then has something to say in the public, which also takes money and time. And those voices are mostly underrepresented, underfunded, undersupported, slower to get tenure. All of the systemic things we know about academia also impact women and women of color in particular who are trying to do this kind of work. So that's a challenge in terms of how the systems of academia work. And certainly, I think it has been journalists, in particular women journalists, who have followed our work and made some of these ideas mainstream. And also people, like Kate and others who are working in institutes and think tanks outside of academia, but in partnership and in relationship with academia. And those things are very important. Obviously, we have a responsibility to translate research, especially if you're at a public institution, to the greater public good. And I think many of us are deeply committed to that. It's difficult because when we talk about CS programs, engineering schools, business schools, I think right now, for me, the thorn in my side is watching places like Stanford and MIT. No shade to anybody who's here from there. But now doing like human-centered AI and thinking about like ethics and computing and raising $1 billion. Both of those institutions declaring a $1 billion with a B fundraising goals and getting those campaigns kicked off with hundreds of millions of dollars from industry and alums. And those of us who work in public institutions don't have that kind of access and resource. And this is one of the ways that I also see the conversations about ethics and power getting co-opted into those spaces and not being about those conversations, quite frankly. I'm sure most of us followed the deep public criticisms about Stanford's, new initiative, having no Black people whatsoever on their board, and again, I guess maybe the questions about war criminals. I don't know. These are the kinds of questions about who gets to be on the board. So these are the kinds of structural challenges that I think we deal with in academia too, which is that it's not that there aren't people doing the work, but those people are often in humanities departments, in social science departments. I'm in information studies at UCLA. Going back to that, it's a department of 14 people buried in an ed school. No one even knows that we exist. So, those structural challenges of the academy, I think, are a part of why it's not actually that easy to integrate oneself into the engineering school. And there's also a politics of, recognition that somehow you're not legitimate unless you are in the engineering school. And I think we have to resist those impulses too, that until they legitimate these concerns, they're not really legit. So there's, these are complex structural issues too, but these are the places and spaces where we work, and this is a site where I think we're also trying to attempt to organize or disrupt and do different things.
Kate?
Yeah, this is a really tough question. It's obviously a debate that's happening in the US and across Europe and in the global South as well, which is, how do we start to reconstitute university spaces to think about how CS and engineering is taught. I mean, one of the reasons we created the AI Now Institute as a university institute, and I should underline, just for Safiya, we are not a think tank and we're not sort of in a sort of adjacent, we're very much in a university, and the way that we did that was to create a partnership between 6 different faculties. So yes, engineering, yes, computer science, but also social science, also fine art, also law, to really try to include a very broad coalition of disciplines and of people across the university who want to start thinking about these issues. Now, in some ways, this is not new. I mean, artificial intelligence in particular was, in its very earliest years, in the sort of 1950s and 60s, was interdisciplinary. I mean, you had people like Margaret Mead sitting down on panels talking with sort of the so-called technical founders of AI systems. I mean, to really return to these much more sort of diverse ways of thinking and seeing, I think is actually really key. And for us, part of the intervention that we want to make here at AI Now is specifically that sort of intervention, is to say that this prioritization, this hagiography of the technical at the cost of everything else has been part of the real problem that we have now been saddled with, which is that sort of ideas of technocracy and engineering being where all important things happen, where all of the investment goes, has actually created this incredibly narrow discourse and this very attenuated way of thinking about how problems can be solved and addressed. So I deeply believe that there's work that can be done inside the academy and must be done inside the academy to really shift those modes of production, modes of learning to far more diverse and far more critical modes of inquiry. I think we can do a lot there. But I also think that this issue of, universities themselves are very much sort of within particular economies that Safiya has noted, within both the private and the public sectors. We've seen these sort of billion-dollar institutes be created for the first time, and they aren't really sort of necessarily reflecting the sorts of issues that Safiya and I have been talking about today. So this is yet another reason why, Wendy's research group, others like it that are starting to spring up around the country and the world, really are exciting to me, and actually the ways in which we can all start to work together. Because while we may have fewer resources than the big guns, I think we are actually seeing the real issues that are going to be taking place more and more over the next few years. And we have an enormous opportunity to work together, to collaborate, and to have strength in numbers.
We'll take a couple more questions. There was a, yes, right here, and the gentleman here. Yes.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just curious as to whether you feel, let me just frame this a little bit. In sort of the corporate world, ethics seems to have fallen into the realm of regulation, where you sort of have this sort of baseline ethics below which you cannot operate, and then this is how a lot of companies sort of treat ethics. However, I'm wondering if you see a possibility of ethics being more of an aspirational goal, where we can set a set of positive ethics to strive for, rather than a sort of baseline below which we cannot sink. And given that there is a sort of corporate race at the bottom whenever regulations are concerned, I wonder if it's even useful considering these kinds of thoughts, really. Thanks.
Let's take a couple more in the pool. Yes, right in front there.
Thank you. So I would like to continue a little bit Safiya's criticism of ethics. When we speak about ethics of AI, it sounds to me like ethics of the occupation, the enlightened occupation, or ethics of settler colonialism. It is mostly that. And this brings me to ask, or maybe to comment, how can we think beyond the terms that settler colonialism gave us? And I'm thinking, Kate, especially in relation to the work that you did, you analyzed images as if they are floating in the world. And I know that you try to criticize this way that they are labeled, but on the other hand, you stayed in the realm of images, completely disconnected from the world from which they were harvested. And they were harvested, they could be harvested only because settler colonialism opened worlds to this kind of harvest. So the question is how we cease as scholars to relate to these fragments of data in the form of images or documents, etc., and narrate their own histories. Because, coming back from the way that machine today recognize images to Bertillon or to Lombroso means really being kept by these histories of image analysis or in profiling methodologies or technologies, rather than assuming that these technologies were invented way earlier than the invention of the devices that enable this kind of profiling. And I'm thinking about the flagship of the imperial enterprise, slavery. Slavery is the technology of profiling. So rather than repeating all the time these kind of internal genealogies of those guys who took photographs and classified them, Bertillon, Lombroso, or others, and finding few others, even Margaret Mead, that was part of the imperial project, part of appropriating others' culture. Rather than these genealogies, I think that we have to question seriously the temporality in which we are working. And rather than assuming that photography was invented in 1839 when few white guys invented some devices, rather than thinking that, cybernetic was invented post-World War II or before World War II, to follow others, to understand that, all these technologies of classifying people were started in 1492, if not a little bit earlier, and try to understand or to continue to pursue our research in this kind of temporality. And I think that the problem of ethics, it's not only the problem of individual, as you rightly presented it, Safiya, but I think that it's also the problem of accepting that these technologies are separate from other technologies, and then people can speak about their ethics. But there is no ethics to settler colonialism, and what we have to understand is that these technologies are part of the settler colonial technologies, and we have to think about how we dismantle settler colonial technologies and not only AI. So it's not really a question, sorry, but it's
it was a beautiful
joining
statement.
your
Thank
conversation.
you. No, I love what you're saying, and I think that, I wrote my book really centering a Black studies tradition because I think to talk about racist representation, there's a long, long history of understanding the histories of racialization, right, which of course are deeply tied to histories of extraction, enslavement, control, disciplining, power. You can't talk about Google and what it spits out divorced from that, because it's actually just a new manifestation of that. So I think you're spot on. I mean, one of the things that is a challenge we know is many of our fields are not interdisciplinary, and so we don't have, we have departments on our campuses. I've always had an appointment in Black Studies because I can't do work in information studies or communication without Black Studies. It's impossible to talk about race and technology with people and colleagues who don't know anything about race, quite frankly. This is one of our challenges, right? These are not new. These are not new ideas. We have incredibly rich, deep fields of knowledge about power. And those do not inform. I often tell my students, my graduate students, you want to do interdisciplinary work. That means you are going to be conversant with many fields, and they are not going to be conversant back with you, right? So, I find this all the time in my work. I know that other scholars of color, we find that we are often in spaces and places trying to talk about these things with people who have this much knowledge about race or gender or sexuality, and that makes it quite difficult then to do the interdisciplinary work. It's really one of the reasons why we need to have critical whiteness, for example, at the center of many of our conferences and conversations, because white people also actually have to critically engage whiteness in order to understand the ways in which they manifest and reify whiteness over and over and over in the technological, in the digital. So, those are hard conversations to have when there's only about 10 people in the room who can go there with you and deepen the conversation. So this is why I think the fallback is like ethics, I mean, that's what I'm really challenging here. The easy thing is to just say, well, like, be a moral person. That's not enough. Do you know how many slaveholders thought they were moral? They were doing it in God's name, literally in God's name, in the name of Christ, or whatever God they worshipped. So morality actually is maybe the conversation. Maybe we need a chief morals officer in these companies instead of a chief ethicist, right? And we actually talk about what is the moral framework. You know, I'm writing a chapter right now on ethics and AI, which is basically this talk, with Matt Bui here, who's a brilliant graduate student at USC Annenberg. And we're talking about it in the context of what is the moral arc of justice, what is the moral framework of justice that undergirds these conversations. And I think, this is where I would just say there are really important voices of underrepresented scholars who are thinking in those spaces, and I invite everyone to join us there, too.
I would second that, and I think certainly to respond to the question, I think the absolute core of the project, specifically around the politics of machine vision with Trevor Paglen, has been precisely to obviate this idea of images floating in space. And what we have done very specifically is look at the historiography of where these images came from, who these images were taken by, what were the contexts as we move from sort of portraiture histories into sort of the extraction of images from things like mugshots, right through to what we start to see happening in the sort of mid-2000s to now, which is mass harvesting across every public platform where you can receive any sorts of images or text whatsoever. So specifically is quite the opposite of seeing images as floating in space, but for a way in which has not been done at all in the AI industry or even necessarily in the humanities so far, is to really trace where those images came from, what were the logics of their construction, and then how were they harvested and deployed. Because I think here we actually start to see some really interesting avenues forward, not just epistemological avenues for thinking precisely about the things around settler colonialism, around white supremacy, and around slavery that have already been mentioned, but specifically even to think about legal actions to actually say that some of these things should not be happening. Until we start to remove this idea of like, oh, all images are the same, we can actually start to say, no, some of these should come with legal penalties. Some of these forms of systems should actually not be built in these ways. And again, part of the reason that I began us in the 1400s with sort of the emergence of artificial perspective is precisely to look at the ways in which these forms of vision are being naturalized and are being seen as somehow external to history or external to precisely these forms of oppression that have produced these technologies. I will, however, push back on this idea that there's no reason to look at the phrenological sort of specifics of what were these sort of moments of thinking and collection of images and then how those images were connected to supposed analyses of human character. I think they're incredibly important, and I think actually getting into the specifics of those historical moments and then looking at why was Bertillon so successful at that time, looking at precisely the sorts of shifts in economic power, the sort of divisions in new forms of wealth inequality, the new forms of capitalism that were sitting alongside those technologies are actually incredibly important. And again, part of the project that we're currently working on now. So I would say that those specificities must remain in frame, and in fact that we have to get more specifically about how systems are built, not just talking about them in the general, to actually look down at these granular levels, to really open up the hood and to see where those things come from, and to give them a name, to look at where they came from, to see who were the people who were used in these ways, and what is their ability to actually say, not in my name, not in this way, and not for these reasons. Thanks.
Okay, so with that, it's time for us to move on to the very important